I think we can call the meeting to order. Sound good? All right, so we'll first look at the agenda. You guys want a copy? There's paper copies if you do. Are there any changes or
Can write.
edits to the agenda? Any additional items we need to add? It's just giving us a.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We move to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Sure.
Yeah, come on, not all at
We
once.
have a second to approve the agenda?
Sure.
All right. Perfect.
Something, hey.
All right. So do we have public participation? Anybody online?
No, just we have our members, Chris and Paul.
Perfect.
Kind of a dumb.
Heather's here,
maybe.
Hmm.
Do we ever put it on the agenda to approve the minutes? I noticed the minutes are there, but I mean, usually minutes come through and people go, I like them. I want to correct those minutes or that type of thing.
That's actually a good idea. We probably should add that as a standing agenda item. Minute approval. Yep,
I didn't see anything wrong with them. but Good point.
that is a good point. Alright.
Do you want to add that to today's anyways?
We certainly can. Did everybody have a chance to look at the meeting minutes? All right, well, any changes, additions, edits? Hearing none, I would,
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Didn't we re-up a couple of our committee members' terms? I don't see that in here.
It happened at the board meeting.
Yeah, we, to proceed to the board with the recommendation. Yes.
Okay. But I mean, I guess I don't see that captured here in the minutes.
It
Does that
happened
matter?
at the
Yeah.
previous meeting.
Oh,
and
was
then
that
it
previous meeting?
went
Oh, okay.
What's that right here? Reapplication?
I see it.
Motion?
It's right here. It says under the agenda,
Number
number
5.
4 and number 5.
Oh, yep, I've got it too. My bad. All right, thank you.
All right, well, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
So move. Second.
So, what-
And then discussion and then vote.
Oh, any discussion? All right, can we vote to approve the minutes? All in favor?
Yes.
Any opposed? All right, hearing none. Approved. Good public participation. All right, so we'll move on to the board meeting overview.
Yep, I can give that off. So the board met in June, second week of June. So I think it was June 13th or on the second Thursday of June, forgetting the date that is. We started out with a audit report. So our audit was underway. The audit, usually we like to have the audit finished before the end of the calendar year. This year we were past that. And a lot of that had to do with our changing of our finance software system. So we used to have this finance software system called Sage, and we now use a finance software system called Cassell. And the change from Sage last fiscal year into this fiscal year was challenging. And so that was a cause for our audit being delayed. But the auditors did come back with their audit presentation, and the kind of long short of it is we're meeting all of our requirements and our needs. There was one finding in the audit, which was that LRAPA needs to have a policy that says that we need to assure that our books are fully balanced in a software system before we transition into the next software system, which was not the approach that LRAPA took when we made that software transition. And that's why the audit was slower and more challenging this year around. So we will be bringing to the board in July the full audit report from Eisler, as well as our policy for the board to review and adopt by resolution. The policy that will be, we make sure that all of our books are balanced before we make that software conversion in the future. And At the moment, El Rapa has no plans to make any software conversion for many, many years because it's a big lift to do that work. And so we're happy with Cassell and the transition we made. There's a lot of benefits that we have that we didn't have in Sage. So there's that's a good component to making that shift, but we're not looking to make it anytime soon. So from there, we shared out on our federal grants work, our environmental justice government to government work that was terminated by the EPA. We're closing out that. Something that's worth noting, though, is some of the work that was described under the EJ government to government work, which was Lane County Public Health doing some data analysis on some public health data sets. We have funding under our targeted airshed grant that we can use to still do this work. So that work will still be ongoing, that data health analysis. The EPA, we shared to the board some of the changes on the EPA level. So the EPA is closing 2 offices. The office, the OAQPS, which is the Office of Air Quality Procedures and Standards, I think. It's basically the office that sets our national ambient air quality standards. A second office was closed as well that's responsible for things like the Energy Star program and the acid rain program. And then the EPA is creating a new office or 2 new offices to essentially kind of replace some of the work that those closed offices did. How they will replace that work or what those offices will look like, those are details that are not yet known that the EPA is still putting together. But we're plugged in and wanting to make sure we're maintaining those relationships. Also shared that outdoor burning season closed on June 6th of this year, which was early closed by ODF and the Lane County Fire Defense Board because of the fire concern. Our rules close outdoor burning season by June 15th. So that was predated a little bit. That's kind of a typical thing that happens every year. So no surprise that happened this year. And then shared with the board, a program that we have called the Supplemental Environmental Project, which is an ability for in the enforcement space, El Rapa can have a pre-approved list of environmental beneficial projects that anybody who is paying an enforcement fee over $2,000 can choose to have some of those enforcement dollars go towards funding some of those supplemental environmental projects. It's a framework that El Rapa has always had. The state has the same framework, and so does the EPA. I would say that El Rapa hasn't utilized that framework as much with a supplemental environmental project. So one of the things I'm trying to do is for us to breathe some life and vigor into that framework so we can hopefully use enforcement dollars to fund some good community projects across Lane County. So engage with the borough board on that. And then the last thing that we did with the board meeting was gave a presentation, which is the one that we'll give today to the CAC, which is the permit life cycle. So essentially our stationary source permitting program is our largest program at El Rapa. And so it was an overview of that program and how we issue our permits, what kind of permits we issue, and how we ensure compliance on those permits. And that's kind of a quick, fast overview of the board meeting earlier.
I'll share. I think that's important.
Yeah, and so on a different item, but what Matt pointed out, so we have been made aware from Lane County Public Health that the community change grant that Lane County had, it was a $20 million grant, federal grant that was terminated, has adjusted some of their funding. And so Teresa Rorick, her position that she had is no longer a position that Lane County Public Health supports. Teresa she still works for the Lane County Public Health. They were able to move her into a different role, but the role that she had has been terminated. And Lane County Public Health will be finding a different support that they can bring to the CAC, but Teresa is not going to be able to continue her role on the CAC. So thanks, Matt. That's another good share out to have as well.
Bummer.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Lane County lost that, or that the $20 million community change grant was terminated is a real disappointment. And a outcome of that is this is one of the outcomes.
But they intend to find a different person to be able to fill that.
Yeah, so
Okay.
Jeff Karaman, I think is how you said his last name. He was on the Lane County Public Health, or he's from Lane County Public Health. He was on our CAC. His work and his role was he would do a food and safety health inspection.
Right.
So I don't know if it'll be another food and safety health inspector that they'll, plug into the CAC. So they're still, I think, reflecting on where that resource is going to come from, but yeah.
All right.
Question.
Yeah.
Regarding those approved funding programs, is there a list of those anywhere that could be shared?
And like what do you mean by
You
approved?
said that there were
Oh,
approved funding programs for apparently violators can direct where their penalties go to.
yep. So we don't have that list just yet.
Okay,
So we have the framework to where LRAPA can receive applications for community projects. We can then approve and put onto a list. So one of the things that we'll be getting out here shortly, something Matt's working on, is our kind of public blast to saying, hey, we have a web page where we can receive applications. If you have an idea, please send your application in so we can start to curate that list.
thanks.
Perfect.
But once those applications, assuming we get them in and get them approved, they will actually live on the SEP web page
Yeah.
so that you would be able to see them yourself.
And one of our potential future topics is we'll be going into it in a little bit more detail and
Yeah.
kind of percentages and caps and those types of things. Okay.
Yeah, so some of the things is if it's over $2,000, then that's an opportunity for a SEP to be considered. Only up to 80% of an enforcement fee can be utilized. It's not so someone's in an enforcement space and they're paying an enforcement fee. There's no reduction for participating in the SEP program. It's just of that fine, I guess you could say, 80% of it can go towards supporting this. The other 20% of it, LRAPA, once a year, divert those dollars to the Lane County General Fund. So any enforcement dollars that we collect, LRAPA does not hold on to. By state statute, those go to the Lane County General Fund. So part of the conversation with the board earlier this month was a recognition that if there's lots of SEP activity that's taking place, these would be Lane County General Fund dollars that are going to be used to fund these programs as opposed to just going to Lane County. And Lane County's perspective, Commissioner Lovell was agreeable to that adjustment and is excited to see what community projects we might be able to fund.
Question. Many years ago, I was involved where there was a settlement of a lawsuit over a water issue.
Mhm.
And we privately agreed that we'd pay into a SEP,
Mhm.
but it wasn't an agency action. It was between a private group and the private company, but we utilized a DEQ SEP for a water issue. If there was a similar circumstance like that, would LRAPA have the ability to accept money like that?
So we would, in our policy, we would assess the fee. And then we would have whoever is paying that fee to pay those dollars to us. And we would keep that as a line on our books of saying, here's this enforcement dollar came in. And then we would sub-award ourselves whatever those dollars may be to the recipient of that. As opposed to, it sounds like in your circumstance that you're describing, the business just had a relationship with whoever is doing that work and paid that money to them and then documented to DEQ, hey, we did this as a receipt. Our approach is we work with the enforcement and we collect those dollars, and then on a different line, we then issue those dollars to that program. If that answers your question.
So it would pretty much not go through LRAPA. They'd contact whoever was organizing the SEP.
Well, we would, so in enforcement,
Well, I'm saying not an enforcement, though, like a private
Oh.
legal settlement where someone agrees to pay into a SEP.
I see.
They wouldn't go through LRAPA. They'd contact the SEP
Hmm.
people.
I would, in the context as I'm understanding as you're describing, I would agree with what you're saying, but I don't necessarily know if I have the full context.
I think you've got it
Okay.
now. So
I would imagine we would just want to know that you were awarding to, so that we could know that, oh, this step is being, that this step has been like acted upon or whatnot, but.
We
Yeah.
the part of the SEP policy, is they have to be kind of like refreshed, so to speak. Which is they will just expire on our list over a set period of time. Unless those who have that SEP basically indicate to us that they would like that program or application to still remain valid.
And the reason for that is to ensure that the group or whomever can actually act upon it. Cause say they put in an application, it's 4 years later, they've kind of disbanded or their capacity to act is no longer there. That would be really not a good situation for anybody at that point.
Perfect.
I'm excited about the framework exists, and it's just LRAPA hasn't necessarily had the programmatic pieces in place for us to take advantage of the framework. So I'm excited to see once we get the programmatic aspects set up, what it looks like and what it evolves to. So
Yeah, agreed. I'm definitely interested to hear more detail because I could envision ideas coming from a variety of different places.
Yeah.
So. Perfect. All right, should we move on to the next topic, which is the permit life cycle?
Max Huffley, our operations manager, which I know you have met before, he plugs in a lot of times online, but he and I are tag teaming this presentation, and we did this with the board meeting, and the way it worked with the board and how it will work here is I know the talking points, or think I know the talking points, and Max is the stopgap in case I start to say things that are technically not correct, or if there's a question that's outside my scope. So he's plugging in to join with us.
Similar to the board, we're situated in the,
Yes.
Travis is at one end of the table and I was at the other, so we got us in stereo again.
Yeah. So this is a presentation to the CAC on our life cycle and how we do the work for our stationary source permitting program, which is our largest program here at LRAP, and is essentially how our commercial and industrial businesses meeting the rules and regulations that are either federal, state, or local. And the way that we do that is by issuing permits. So our ACDP is our air contaminant discharge permits. So when I say an ACDP, that's what that is. You can reflect on it as it is basically a state permit. So it's state authority that's drafting these that is existing to allow these ACDPs to exist. And the role is to protect public health. So essentially it's a vehicle, a document that helps us assure that we are meeting the national ambient air quality standards, which the EPA set, helps us to ensure compliance because ACDPs are legal documents. So they are items that we will look to and can enforce upon if needed and necessary. They're also the place where all of these rules or all of these permit conditions are written down in one place so the public can see it and engage on it and give feedback if they have any to give. So as I mentioned, it is a regulatory role, enforceable document for us. It serves as our point to document or tangible item that we can say, this is what you need to follow. And if you're following these permit conditions, you will be meeting all of the rules and regulations. And that's our authority under the state rules and is typically in our Title 37, where a lot of these items are kept. Those are some examples of some of the processes or industry types that our permitting program has. Max, do you want to kind of go through what a couple of those items might be for folks?
Yeah, just to give you some context here, you're probably familiar with what these are referring to, but we have facilities that manufacture like rock crushers, so they're fabricating metal and doing surface coating activities. We have our largest industrial source is the pulp and paper plant, so they're making container board. So those are kind of some examples. We have other sources that combust fuel. They're primarily doing that to create steam to dry lumber or some other part of their process. We have some folks that generate power, 3 or 4 facilities that have turbines on site that they're actually generating electricity and putting that to the grid. As I mentioned, surface coating, folks that make display signs for grocery stores and whatnot. Petroleum and fuel storage, that's a big sector that we regulate. In terms of permitting numbers, that's our biggest category. So we regulate over 100 gasoline dispensing facilities or gas stations that have general permits that we'll talk about later. Of course, waste management, the Title V, landfill is subject to Title V. And then we also have crematory incinerators. And then just a second, and also we have facilities that are subject to these federal standards that are applied to certain categories of facilities. In terms of,
Hey,
and
can you guys hear me?
yeah, hey,
Sorry, that chat function's turned off, and so I can't ask a question. I can't raise my hand. It's turned off as well. But I was just wondering, I have this whole presentation printed out, so I'm following along, but I was just wondering, we can't see your screen. So if you intended to share it, I don't know about my colleagues that are online here, but
Thanks, Chris. No, that was a total swing and a miss on my part. I appreciate it. I was wondering, I was like, why can't we?
perfect, all good. We can see it. Thank you.
Regarding the petroleum and fuel storage, are pipelines included in that?
yeah, so the gasoline terminal, so there's a national gasoline pipeline that terminates here at the end of, Napa Valley, and so there's a fuel terminal where the, trucks that go to fill up to eventually take that gasoline to the service stations, they get that gasoline there. They are regulated under a Title V permit.
But the pipelines themselves as well?
Yeah,
Okay.
they're not, there are some compressor stations for the natural gas pipeline, which is different than the gasoline pipeline. But yeah, the natural gas pipeline does have some compressor stations that are regulated.
Okay. Thank you.
And the fuel storage includes diesel?
It does. Diesel is not very volatile, so it doesn't contribute much to the volatile organic compounds, but they are regulated.
Do you know if any of that diesel is reserved or dedicated for emergencies, for access in emergencies?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Yeah.
I know that Lane County, from a resiliency perspective, is interested in that question in terms of, if there is a disruption or if there is whatever the potential natural hazard may be, where are those gaps? And yeah, from that perspective, that is Lane County is, I'm familiar with having a lot of those reflections.
Because I think there's efforts at the state level to kind of decentralize to the state and not rely so much on the CEI hub in Portland.
Let's see, so the next slide here. So there's these items called plant site emission limits, which is essentially a limit that in our permit condition will say, here's the most amount of emissions that you can emit and don't go over those lines. There used to be in Oregon, we had these things called generic PSELs, where you would say, okay, generically, like here's about how much that you should have based off, I think was it category, like a categorical generic PSEL?
Yeah, we used to set the PSEL at 1 ton less than the significant emission rate. So we just basically cap them at right below the level at which an additional air quality analysis would be required. So.
But after a rulemaking that DEQ went through a number of years ago, that is not an approach that we do in Oregon anymore, and they are more source specific on those potential emission limits. So this graphic here is just showing the different types of permits that LRAP will issue, starting with the most complicated at the top, which is our Title V operating permits, and then basic being the most simple, which is there at the bottom. And you can see how those sources are distributed. So in Lane County, 14 Title V sources, standard being the most complicated state level permit you can get at 24 sources. 29 is simple. A general ACDP, so like a gas station or like a sawmill, for example, we have a sawmill general permit. That is a single permit that then people or sources will get assigned to that permit. So if you're a gasoline dispensing facility, that work is pretty much the same. And so all the rules and regulations and requirements are the same for everybody. So instead of giving a permit to every gasoline dispensing facility, we just have our one permit and then we assign sources to those permits. So that's how general ACDPs work. And then basic is even less than that, in terms of how much of a oversight and engagement with us, is needed.
So just for clarity, when it talks about permit types ranked from complexity, lowest complexity, is that based on volume? Is that based on emissions or all the above? You know, just for people.
I'll have to tap out on that one to Max on how do we, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a generalization. You know, we have some Title V, well, we used to have some Title V facilities that were less complicated than some standard ACDP. So it is kind of a generalization, but generally, it's, you know, the more complicated facilities operations are, the more likely that they're going to be at the higher end of that hierarchy. But yeah, it's
Not necessarily quantity based or,
correct, yeah.
Isn't there a Title V threshold though, if you're below that emission rate? You're not Title V?
Correct, yeah. So, you know, major sources have to get Title V operating permits, or they can take, accept or request a limit that keeps them out of a Title V permit. So that's generally 100 tons per year of a criteria pollutant like carbon monoxide or VOCs.
And all of those are 5-year reviews.
Yeah, well, we have another slide on that coming up that talks about the permit terms. Yeah, some of them are 10-year terms.
Yeah, I was curious about how that affects your workflow. Like, do you have certain years where you have a lot more that come due?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, so these here, these are 10-year permits. So a basic, general, or simple, once every decade is how long that permit needs to be updated. If it's beyond that, so if it's a standard or Title V, it's a 5-year permit cycle. And we, per permit cycle, we will do an inspection. If it's 5 years versus 10 years, so that's like a double needing that in that timeline, as well as like for Title V sources, we have FCE obligations or expectations, so full compliance evaluations. And so in terms of like workload, we do have some permits where this year we have 5 permits and then they're all, you know, needing to be renewed this year. As where another year, we don't have any or we have 1. And so how in that 10 to 5-year overlap, there are some years where there will be a number of them together, and then there are other years where there's not as many. So that does have an impact on how busy we may be depending on what 5 to 10-year swing we're through. So.
which is pretty different than like DEQ's water where the 2017, it comes out on a year. This is once, if somebody applies, they get 10 years from the date of
Oh,
issuance,
really?
right?
I'm not familiar with water quality and you're gonna have more insight into that.
I
than
guess,
do.
so if somebody were to apply for a permit, a basic, and get it today, they would be 10 years from today, right? So it's not on a regular schedule where El Rapa automatically redoes the permit. Because right now,
I
there
know
are
what
about
you
8
mean.
DEQ permits that are all expiring. They're working on all of them because the way they do it is like when it gets finished, it's only good for 5 years.
I see.
Unless, you know, and so it actually is much simpler how you guys are doing it. If that's how it works, is 10 years from date of issuance.
I would say our generals are kind of like that a little bit, but usually a permit renewal process for general is more of a that's on us as opposed to that's on the source. Yeah.
Interesting.
But for both types of permits, water or air, if you reapply in a timely manner and your permit expires on the calendar, the old permit stays in effect until it's
Maintain
reissued.
coverage, right?
Yeah, and we would call that administratively extended. And when we speak to a backlog, that's what we're talking about, are those sources that we have not yet issued their new permit, but they got their application to us on time. We just haven't gotten them their permit before the old one expired. So here's the 5-year permits, which are the standard, and the simples boxes there are bigger because there's more specific details to share. So the Title V permits, what gets you into the Title V club is emissions over 100 tons per year, or a hazardous air pollutants, 10 tons per year of a single pollutant, or if you combine all of your hazardous air pollutants, and it's over 25 tons, then that's the Title V requirement. And kind of what Max was saying earlier, some sources will say, well, we'll take a limit on how many widgets we're making, because part of our calculation of how much emissions we're creating is we say, well, one widget makes this much emissions. And so we'll only produce so many widgets this year, which means our emissions will be below this line. And then part of our follow-up is saying, well, where's your logs and record keeping that's showing you only made so many widgets in a year? Which I think is part of like a next slide, actually.
So on that note, though, out of curiosity, one of the things that I've seen on permits, even doing like review of people, right, their renewal stuff, is that they don't come close to their production of being what they're allowed. So this is triggered though by what you're allowed to do, not necessarily what you're doing, correct?
Right, yeah, it's gets complicated, but it's generally looked at on a potential to
Okay,
emit. So
okay.
whatever, could be the capacity of the equipment, the whatever bottlenecks exist or don't exist. That's what we would look at, capacity first, and then if they want to request a limit, that's potential to emit that lowers their potential to emit.
Okay.
Yeah, because they may have the ability to make so many widgets, but the reality of them making that many widgets is like, there's no way we can make that many widgets.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and that's something that, just for other people to know, like, what's the capability of the machinery versus what is the actual output, because can be quite different, but.
So I didn't kind of get skipped on the slide, but so part of what our tool of compliance is those emission limits. We say, what's the line? Don't go above it. Have monitoring. So we say, are you monitoring like fence line monitoring, which you don't have an item or a source that has that in Lane County. Source testing. What source testing is we say, okay, you have your emissions coming out. We need you to take a sample of those emissions so we can do some analysis of what actually is in it. So then when we're calculating how much is coming out of the stack, we have better data on those calculations. Record keeping, such as if you are taking a limit and saying we will only make so many widgets, you're recording those items down so we can inspect and look and make sure that that's the case. And then reporting to us annually or semi-annually, depending on what the particular permit type is, which will be things like what were your productivity levels, what were your emissions, did you have any complaints that were received to you, did you have any upset conditions, which need to be reported to us when they happen, and then also on some of those annual and semi-annual reports.
Travis, question for you. Is it during the emission limits or maybe Max is best, the control technologies and discussing how those might help lower emissions? That's taken into consideration, right? Like bag houses and other things during that emission limits kind of piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, I would, my first answer to that is we would say, well, what would be your pollution that you'd be creating or emissions you'd be creating? And then what are the controls that you have on those emission streams that can then reduce what those would actually be going into the atmosphere? But how would you phrase that, Max?
Yeah, generally it's kind of up to the discretion of the applicant to decide what the control technology is, but at certain levels, there's like a regulatory analysis that's required, like for larger projects, there's what's called best available control technology, which is you list all the possible control technologies that could work from a top down, and then you eliminate the ones that are essentially economically, environmentally not feasible. And so there are certain ways in which we can force a control technology that the applicant may not want, to be honest.
Well, we would like to, in all circumstances, have a collaborative approach, so all parties involved are agreeable with what the needs and expectations may be from an environmental perspective, but yeah. So the process for ourselves is, here as the animations take place. So we receive an application. So we have a number of things that we may need depending on what that particular business or process may be. We do an administrative review, which is essentially, did you check all the boxes in our application? And then if they checked all the boxes, it gets kicked over to a technical review. And that's where we say, okay, what follow-up questions do we have? What details do we feel are missing from the information we have here? That goes into permit drafting from the permit writer who is assigned that particular source. We pass it around internally for some peer review. Max has a look at it. Then we send it over to the applicant for their feedback, their review. Sometimes there can be discussion there. Once we're at a place where we're like, we think this permit is ready to be issued, we will put it out for public comment, which is at minimum a 35-day or 30-day, depending on what the particular permit is. We have a title I believe it's Title 13, a public participation title, which will say, if this is happening, then here's what LRAPA will do from a public outreach, public participation component. If there's a need, we will have a public hearing. Part of our titles also describe when those hearings will take place. Oftentimes, when we have a hearing, usually it's an internal decision that we make from a recognizing what the community feedback is or the interest that may exist on the source of having that hearing. If it's a Title V permit, the EPA does review it. These are actually Title V permits are federal permits, which LRAPA has been delegated the authority to issue that permit. So because of it, the EPA is the final stop on review for their process. Usually that's a 45-day window for the EPA to provide any feedback to us. If we don't hear anything from the EPA in that 45 days, we are free to issue the permit. If the EPA has feedback for us, then we have to take that feedback and incorporate that before we're able to issue that permit. And if the changes are significant enough, it might restart a public process. Max, if we get feedback from the EPA, would we have to then go through a public hearing process again or a public comment period?
Those comments resulted in LRAPA making changes to the permit that would, reduce the stringency or something like that, that would require an additional public notice.
The public comment stage, I think there's a certain level of comment, like 3 or more comments or a group representing more than 10 or 12 people or something like that, would trigger a public hearing. And is there another way for are there public hearings that are required regardless of public comment, or does it always hinge on the level of public comment?
So our titles, we have what's called a Category 4 public notice requirement, so the stipulations, I'd have to refresh my mind on exactly what checks gets to that Category 4. But if it is a Category 4, which is based on if the source is making these changes and if there's significant enough of changes that we can objectively recognize, then a public hearing is required. If it's a level 3 or less, that's not required. So we can, by our rules, be required to have a public hearing. And also part of that is if it's a group representing, I believe the number is 10 or more, or 10 individuals request a hearing, then we will be responsive to that and have that. In the past, we have received requests for public hearings that have not met that threshold, and we have still proceeded with a public hearing anyway, based off that interest from the community.
But something I learned that I think is maybe helpful, especially as a citizen advisory committee, is that the mechanisms of a public hearing would be very unsatisfying to most people trying to participate in what they believe is going to be discourse about. Let me share what I don't like about this, etc. Kind of that is a public information session, which we did with Kingsford, where we'll have the permit writer, the Max is the operations director, and we have a much more natural discourse because a public hearing is very formal and formative, and like there's a process, and basically everyone's going to hear from us and they have to sit and listen. And I believe there's a really brief section at the end where they can comment, but it has to really be technical about the permit and from a scientific approach of like, here is my concern is that you calculated your CO2 at a level that's inadequate based on my understanding of CO2 emissions or whatever. But if someone goes, I think it's going to stink and be loud around my neighborhood, it doesn't have any bearing, unfortunately, even though that may be factually and true for that person. As far as the permit's concerned, it's noted, it's recorded, but it may not have any impact on the permit proceeding forward. And so that's where I really liked when I got here with Kingsford. We did an informational session specifically because we knew that people wanted to be heard. They wanted to hear from us directly about, we hear you, or here's what we're doing, or Kingsford had the opportunity if they so chose, in which this case it wasn't necessary to even speak back. But they're two different creatures. But I feel like when I hear public hearing, I'm like, yeah, we're going to be able to share what we think. Not the case.
Yeah, I mean, Matt brings up a valid point, which is a hearing itself is going to be very dissatisfying to the general public, especially if they have an interest in what's taking place. A public hearing is a process for us to formally receive oral comments, and we do not officially respond to any comments until the public comment period is closed. And then we respond in writing. And to Matt's point, if it's what we would call a substantive comment, which is if someone expresses a comment that is, you could qualify as purely opinion, we cannot act on those items. The only things that we can act on in terms of modifying the permit or making adjustments to it is objective, tangible items that point out things that we could do differently based on what that comment is. I also think, kind of following up on Matt's point too, it's important that we pair all of our public hearings with an informational session. Because once we go into the hearing mode, we don't respond until the public comment period closes. So we set the stage to say we're in an informational meeting session. So this is where we can have an informal Q&A. So for those who are I just want to understand what is taking place, because I know that there's a business over there and I have some reflections of what might be putting in the air and I am concerned about that. The informational session is where I believe that ORAPA's role from a science education perspective to say, here's the technical things that's taking place that we're working on, and help to set that grounding contextual stage for what can hopefully be more informed and helpful substantive comments that we can potentially respond to.
And they'll actually be able to hear from us in real time, where the hearing is like,
Yeah.
okay, now we're done, and we'll
In 2
write
weeks, we'll
back.
get back to
Yeah.
So if I might add, informational hearings I've been to, there are some people who believe that RAPA's role is to shut the door on any pollution, not really understanding that there's a set of rules that everybody's got to work under. And that can be hard to accept, especially in a charged meeting.
Yeah, I think sometimes those, there can be a hope that RAPA is taking a no emissions or air pollution approach, but that is not how the Clean Air Act works. That is not what our role and function is. Our role and function is to provide permits or permission for emissions to be created, but assuring that that permission and that process is meeting the democratic rules and regulations that we have established through the Clean Air Act and then statewide through our ACDP program and beyond.
So a question, and I'm not sure exactly how to word it, but is there any recognition, incentive along those lines for people to go above and beyond the minimum? And or is it now going to set a new lower standard that they're going to have to abide by? But one of the things I could see, especially with outreach and those types of things, is the controls, right? Incentives or recognition, or is there an operator of the year who went above and beyond, something like that, who exceeded and did improvements, or is that just not appropriate for?
Well, I hear what you're saying. I would say from a regulatory framework, there's nothing that exists in a hey, we need to celebrate our great successes. I think from a cultural perspective, there can be value in recognizing when people or organizations, businesses are doing those things or taking those extra steps. That's an internal programmatic item that we could put together and focus on. We at the moment don't have anything of that degree, but I do see that there is value of saying, hey, let's celebrate these circumstances where we've seen pollution reduction, or someone has taken on pollution controls because it's better for the environment, even though regulatorily speaking, there's not a onus for them to do that. So
Having perused the old newsletters, there was, back in the 70s, we would do a formal dinner, it looked like, where they would have people would come and they would do awards in front of their
I think
peers.
it's good for everybody. I think it's good for industry and also good for the community to see, these. We're moving in the right direction. I guess that's one thing that with permits, I often wonder about, all these, as we increase all these things, there are improvements and we just don't celebrate them enough. But I was curious if you're even allowed,
there's
a bit of a
preventing
conflict
us
or
from
anything.
doing that. And I do think that just even as I try to develop a relationship with my cat, and I'm looking online of how can I have a relationship with my cat better, and the things I see online is celebrate and positive, and I think that those same levels of how can as a regulator you develop good relationships with those you're regulating, and that comes through celebrating and recognizing the positive things and what programs might support that. I think there's worthwhile reflections in that. Yeah.
And I we have a slide about the Lux, but I think it kind of ties into this where we're at, just thinking through the process of a permit is our agency is solely focused on the air pollution, correct? And so that is what we focus on, and that's where our permit and our regulations and all of those things, the regulatory space is. But often businesses have other impacts that will impact the vicinity of their operation that we don't have a say on, right? Like, it's like, oh, there's gonna be 10 times the amount of semi trucks coming through your neighborhood. A very viable concern if I live on that street. But they would come to us thinking we'll be the impediment, to Jim's point, right? Like, hey, El Rapa, you gotta shut this down because, but from, let's say, an air quality concern, we're like, actually, they're really almost zero concern from this particular source. And so that's another element, is that, that at times we have to remember how myopic we're asked to be based on our charge is air permit, right? But there could be water impacts, there could be noise impacts, there could be a lot of other things that it may be very viable, but for as far as El Rapa is concerned, it's like that is out of our scope of focus. And so another piece where sometimes people get, I think, stymied a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that Matt's done since he's been here that I've appreciated is helping in those circumstances, be it on a source or even it's just a complaint. Someone saying, hey, this thing's bothering me. And if it's something that's outside El Rapa's scope, the answer being not just that's outside our scope, look elsewhere, but that's outside our scope, but here's the resources that you're actually looking for, and let's help bridge that gap. So I'll just share on our air permit pre-application meeting. So a thing that we do that's very common is we will get a phone call from someone saying, hey, I have this project, or I want to potentially get this permit or have a business set up shop. What, from an air regulatory perspective, are all of the requirements of me? And so we have that pre-application meeting to say, well, tell us what your idea is, what's your vision, and we'll give you a scope of what that looks like or what that may potentially look like as you engage with us. A quick just note on Cleaner Air Oregon. So Cleaner Air Oregon is a statewide program. It's new, relatively speaking, in the environmental or regulatory space. Adopted in 2019, and it's an air toxic contaminant regulatory program. So we say to sources, there's 600 different types of pollutants called toxic air contaminants. And through this program, we'll say, of the 600, how many are you emitting? What quantity are you emitting? And then there's a review of where are those emissions going, who's breathing them, how much are they breathing, and what is the health risk from that exposure. And if the health risk is high, we have regulatory legal authority to require adjustments, permit conditions to bring that risk lower. We implement Cleaner Oregon here in Lane County, and then DEQ does it outside of Lane County. On the compliance side of things, so we monitor the emission limits through our inspections and our reporting. We provide a lot of technical assistance. Sometimes a source can be like, I have questions about my permit. And we say, well, we're really happy you're bringing us your questions about your permit, so let us talk about them and help provide some insight to it. We follow up on our compliance deadlines and milestones. People have to submit annual or semi-annual reports to us. A lot of our operation meetings sometimes is a list of like, well, who have we not heard from yet? And how are we going to get with them to get that information? We have our regular inspections. If we receive community complaints, that can be the cause of an inspection for us or a site visit. And then we consider and can initiate enforcement when we identify instances of non-compliance. So that was just the review of our stationary source permitting program, which is the vast majority of the work that we do here.
If you wouldn't mind me adding, Title V especially, that monitoring and reporting is very important. And it's one thing to have a requirement to add a control, say, but what people don't think about is there's all the requirements for, say, calibration and record keeping, and sometimes all those pieces can be more onerous than the action itself.
And I think another thing that people don't really realize is, depending on the industry, the emissions are based on limited information. So, for example, right, like quarries, like what are the potential emissions? Well, as a geologist, you know that all the mineralization of rock types are very different. But what it's actually based on is, a study down in California, and it's not clear if it's a quarry, a hard rock, a sand and gravel and all that, but the emissions are, right, they're numbers that you have to plug in for the data. And so as one of the benefits of this stuff though, and the monitoring is we get better and better data over time. And so we're building this database with, right, which is, but it is, working with the best information you have and accumulating information.
And that's where some of the source testing can come from too, is they're like, we kind of would like a little bit more information on this estimation that we're having to make. And so source testing is really, and also then source testing used in demonstrating that you're meeting the permit conditions that you've agreed to.
But the source test, it's usually, there's 3 runs of 1 hour. So you got 3 hours representing a 5-year period. It's pretty much a snapshot in time, and things can really vary over 5 years.
We do, and to that point, which you're right, Jim, is we try to make assumptions, and when we make those assumptions, we make them in a health protective direction. So of that 3-hour window, we'll say, okay, well, let's do that. Let's do that test when your production is like as max as you can have that production. So that way we're getting the over health assumption in those estimations.
Yeah.
And depending on industry, there are specific tests for that industry. So like with an asphalt plant that uses a burner, there's annual burner tune-ups. So even though source test might be only every 5 years, there's other things like calibrations, exactly what Jim is talking about, like depending on your industry, different things that they are required to do. And that's part of the reporting and kind of checking in on things. So I think that's something that's kind of cool about this is the general is more general. And one of the reasons they get more complicated is because of site specific things that have to be taken into account. Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a component of what's fun about being a permit writer, sometimes an inspector, is that variety maybe, yeah?
It's interesting too, because there could also be technological changes like in that asphalt industry that they made an improvement about 5-6 years ago that really reduced the amount of volatiles that came off of the asphalt.
That's one reason I asked, because we actually got a new burner and it radically reduced NOx and these types of things. And it's kind of cool,
They
but
started
it
using
doesn't
much cooler
affect anything as
Yeah.
far as but yeah, so it's just kind of one of those neat things of I'm proud and I'm happy, but it doesn't not looking for recognition, but it is kind of if the community knew, these types of things, it reflects well that there is technology advancements and things.
Yeah.
Opportunity.
Sometimes the rules run ahead of the available emission information. If I could tell a little story, for lumber drying kilns, when the HAP limits were first coming out, there wasn't very good information because it's very difficult to source test a kiln because there's leaks out the doors and vents, and you pretty much have to tint the entire thing to capture, and then you mess up the airflows. So instead, I collected samples of our wood and delivered them up to OSU, and there was a professor who was doing studies. He had a room-sized kiln that he could completely enclose and test. Again, it was just kind of a snapshot in time, but having worked with veneer dryers, when I was choosing the hazardous air pollutants to test for, I said, well, let's test for acrolein because I know we have that in our veneer drying. Nobody had ever tested for acrolein before, as it turns out. And next thing I know, I'm being invited to this big statewide meeting at DEQ over a hazardous air pollutant that nobody was counting. And I was not the most popular guy in that.
Yes, I know. Yeah. I could see how in some neighborhoods you would be the person with a target on your back. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do think that one of the things I appreciate though is I do find this space, this industry, air regulatory, as a evolving and always kind of different and changing, and that is interesting and exciting. And just more from an airshed perspective, I think from stationary sources, at least my concern in terms of what is the real reflection is some of those harder chemical things that you can come out of that. So what are those hazardous air pollutants? What's that reflection? But in terms of an airshed wildfire smoke is like our biggest pollutant that we see here in Lane County. And so that's an evolving space for us as an air regular, is how do we engage on that? And that's just kind of what's interesting and exciting.
So any other comments about the presentation or questions? All right, we'll move on to the next topic, which is upcoming topic. So out of curiosity, has this triggered any other ideas for future presentations? We can always add to this if anybody has any ideas.
Well, actually, I was thinking, I mean, this is all good sort of foundational information, but I wonder if there'd be an interest in taking an actual permit and looking at it and the sort of the more detailed monitoring and reporting sort of things. I mean, there's probably a Title V source that is no longer active, and we could use that to look at how it's actually structured if there's an interest. And same thing with an ACDP.
I certainly have interest. Is that something that would be feasible to put together in a timeline? Perfect. Yeah, let's add it. So I did have one question or comment about the bylaws review. Did we want to merge that with the idea of putting together the packet? Or is that something Elrapa was going to do, or is that something that even I as the chair can do, is put together similar to what Jim was given when he first came on board, right? That just has the member list, the bylaws. Do we want to put together some sort of binder?
I think that's up for discussion, and if there's an interest from the CAC to have that, we, as LRAPA, we can put together that effort and assemble those
Okay.
things. We haven't acted on that in any way, shape, or form yet, but that's definitely something we can
I
do.
think that would, when those get put together with the bylaws, would be the good meeting to go over the bylaws. If that sounds like a good opportunity, we can just kind of go through the packet and then read the bylaws.
And they're fairly brief.
Yeah, I saw that. Yep. Okay, perfect.
So for context, for those who need, so LRAPA, we will, do we want to do that that is the next meeting, I guess. So we will have a packet of, here's our bylaws, here's some information about our board, here's kind of a LRAPA 101 for the CAC. And then a review of that, that'll be, oh, here the bylaws are right in front of me. And then that can maybe kick off a discussion about the bylaws. And if there's any tweaks needed, or if the group's happy as is, or whatever the case may be.
As a follow-up to the budget meeting or the budget discussion that we had before, I'd had a question about private liens on properties in regard to how often they were set, how often they were settled, were there interest rates on them, et cetera. So if we could include that in a meeting for some time in the
Yeah,
future, just a brief discussion.
thank you for bringing that up. I recall you mentioning that, and it went away until just
We
now.
had the
So
budget meeting, so
Okay.
you know, it's logical follow-up then.
So does that also suggest that maybe we have a standing place for like action items, last meeting action items, or to
mm,
kind of touch base on, or would that just be in the meeting minutes?
and like, in terms of, oh, here are the things that we
Memorializing them.
agreed on. Yeah, I
Well, yeah, just if there were action items from the last meeting to make sure that we,
follow up
Follow
on
up on
like a parking lot kind of sort of thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So what are the specific elements that you think would be helpful outside of the bylaws that you would like to see included or example?
so I didn't create, for myself, I have the CAC members. I put together a list of that with the terms, the contact, had the bylaws. I had some stuff on who's on the board. I put Robert's rules for myself because
Yeah.
still trying to learn them. And then I had annual report. So one of the things as the chair and is to put together that annual report, with my own information. It's maybe good for us though, as just the group, to know that there's an expectation to present that report to the board. So
Sure.
that's, and then just a spot for agendas. But I don't know what was actually part of the original.
Well, here's the original from 2011. So bylaws, and then just a directory of the advisory committee members and their contact. But I want to say sometime around 2011, 2012, we wrote a guide to committee and board of directors members. And that may have gotten lost in the
We
annals.
do have the board guidebook, but I didn't know there was a CAC version of that.
That was one of the first things I worked on when I joined the committee. I'll look and see if I've got a copy.
Well, if you have the old, because we have the board handbook, we still have that, but I did not know that there was a CAC handbook. So if you have an old copy somewhere, I'd definitely appreciate that, yeah.
Misremembering.
Well, that would be great.
So just for clarification, do you guys want me to make each member a hard copy actual binder? Do you want it digital as well? Like I could do both.
What do you guys
Preference?
think?
Or does someone not want a hard copy but only want digital? or-
I'm fine with just digital records.
Yeah, digital's good.
Chris, Paul, you guys have a preference, digital or paper, or both?
Digital's fine with me.
Digital's fine with me.
Great.
Keep trying to get the links working on paper.
Not as successful.
Well, that's what it's like, oh, it's gonna be printed. We need to put a QR code on it so somebody can get their phone.
Although, now there's warnings against using those.
Oh, yeah,
Really?
there's always been,
Oh,
well, because
boring.
it's a link and any link, it's a random link, you know.
Right,
if
you don't know where it's.
You
Well,
don't-
downtown Eugene got kind of hacked.
Oh,
All the
really?
parking, you scan the QR code to pay, people put printouts over the top and they're.
No
taking
kidding.
people's-
Wow, that's smart.
Both.
Yeah, it was, there were a few articles about that.
All the good ways to rob people, I guess. That's the
Sneaky.
evil ever.
Plain sight,
Yeah.
Peter, did you say digital or
Digital.
digital?
Okay.
And then Evelina?
Digital. It will suffice then. Perfect.
Yeah, maybe we'll issue it digitally to everyone, and if anyone has a request to get a hard copy, we can accommodate that. But otherwise, we'll just do everybody digitally.
It might be wise to have a hard copy for the chair.
Hmm, I don't know if Kelly's quite ready for that.
We'll see if I prefer mine or yours.
An archival. version.
Well, whenever someone has a folder and they have tabs on the folder, not only do they have tabs on the folder, but then beneath each tab, there's actual paper on the side. That person's organized.
Well, we've gone over a couple of minutes, so what is the protocol? Do we ask if people want to go through the round table or do we just shelf
I
it till
think
the
that's a
next?
chair's decision.
Mhm.
Well, I have time. Would you guys like to take a few minutes to do round table? You guys all have availability for a few minutes? All right, so why don't we start with the people online? Chris, you want to go first, round table?
I don't have much. We're in fire season. I appreciate you guys, making the announcements to help cut off backyard burning. The only thing else I have on that topic now is it seems like our fire seasons are just much more pronounced and longer duration than they used to be. And maybe, Travis, maybe long-term, and I don't know if it would fall through this committee or not, but maybe we should have some discussion about maybe changing those dates so we're not yanking the public around so much, change them to June 1st and October 30th or October 15th, whichever. I can't remember which one it ends on, but
Yeah. Yeah, if it's how many I know that 2 years ago we made it all the way to June 15th, but how regular are we actually making it to that timeline? And
like,
yeah,
like one out of 8 or 9 years in a row. So
yes, yeah. No,
Yeah,
I hear you.
that's-
That's good.
it's the only thing I got. Maybe some future discussion there, but
Thank you, Chris. Paul?
I don't have anything for roundtable.
Okay, thank you. Great. Peter? Ben? Evelina? As for me.
Very quickly, if any of you had noticed, there was, on the Wednesday before Juneteenth, there was the big smoke intrusion in town. I don't know if any of you were aware of that.
Cottage Grove.
Yeah, well, it was out of Junction City. Yeah, there was a 50-acre grass fire that was burned. I think the reason I want to share is just that we as an agency we have an exemption for agricultural burning. But there's also an ORS that in Lane County, agricultural burns aren't to occur. This farmer, says that they got the Oregon Department of Agriculture is okay to burn, got a hold of Junction City's fire department. They said, hey, if it's okay in the parameters, go for it. But we got 22 complaints as an agency, which is probably just the tip of the iceberg of the number of people that were very not happy with what was happening. And if you go online and just look up, it was on KMTR, there was some it looked like a massive amount of smoke came in. And so folks are just really confused and upset and frustrated. They're like, well, it's fire season. Why are they letting people burn their fields, et cetera? So just more so you're aware that we're trying to deal with that. We're not trying to duck any responsibility. It's just we don't have any actual authority over agricultural burning. And in this instance, no, we do not. That is actually Department of Ag.
And there are special permits for out of season
But not in Lane
permits?
County and that's where we're kind of working to kind of piece it together
It's
because
kind of,
Is it unclear at this point?
well, it's more of it's outside the scope of El Rapa's rules and regulations, and it's starting to get into the Department of Agriculture's rules and regulations, so I've been trying to understand their framework on those items, but field burning used to be something that was a lot more common in the Willamette Valley. There was an accident in the 90s, I believe, on I-5 because of some field burning near Corvallis. And so the legislature kind of said, meh. So then the Department of Agriculture still can provide some fields to be burned. They get a number of acres per year that they're able to permit. And there's some very specified sections of the Willamette Valley where they can provide that permission. Lane County is not part of that ORS that Matt referenced. Says Lane County, there is none of this that's taking place. So our Title 47, which is our smoke management title, we have a specific clause that says Department of Agricultural burns are exempt from El Rapa's rules and regulations. So then that reflection of what did this farmer do and did they follow all the processes and procedures to take place is a Department of Agriculture reflection. And we are communicating and working with them to understand what their perspective is on last Wednesday and what actions they may or may not be taking.
Chris may have something to share.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Chris, you may have a lot more insight into this than I.
No, not my agency either, but I was out of country on a fire assignment up in Canada. What date was that? Did you say the 14th?
It was Wednesday, so 18th. Yes, it was 3:00 is when they lit the burn, and we started getting complaints in kind of like 4:45 on that Wednesday. It was in Junction City. I can send you the exact field if you're interested, but
yeah, it's okay. I'm just gonna call my counterpart when I hang up. I'll reach out to my counterpart on the west side of the freeway and just see what he's saying. And it just piques my interest because there's like really kind of a movement, kind of cultural burning, historical cultural burning, and some of that. There's just like really kind of a move that's becoming more prevalent, or at least the desire to become more prevalent here in Lane County. And that's outside the scope of myself or my counterpart in Western Lane District. So we're saying no burning in our districts that we have authority over, but there's plenty of areas that we don't have authority over. So it just caught my attention as something that it was different from what I was expecting the end of the story to be, agricultural versus cultural, but that there isn't a movement out there. So just be aware of that. And,
yeah.
So on that note, it would probably be a proactive move that if somebody, applies for and receives that permit, that you guys are notified. That would be something that you could request, because then you say, yep, they're permitted, talk to the department, permit number.
Recognition that for myself, as I've been thinking from that smoke last event, just in my role as director, is what relationships can I help to foster and to promote? And I think a relationship with the Department of Agriculture is one of the outcomes that I'm recognizing would be real beneficial for us. So, yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, as somebody who had to field complaints, if you can say, yep, we already know about it and this is the situation, it goes a long ways versus I don't know, let me find out, right? Those types of things. So that
Heather, you
I did, and I'm pretty stressed, wish we would have known too, you know?
advance notice would be really helpful.
Well, because it was at 4:45, it's late in the afternoon, we hadn't
I
known.
was
So,
clueless, I'm
yeah.
like, what's going on?
Yeah.
And I think the other piece, which Travis is touching on, is not only get better aligned with the Department of Agriculture, but then if we get clarity and we go, "Oh, okay, Lane County, that can't happen, is then connect with all of our fire districts, which there's numerous in Lane County, and say, hey, if anyone comes to you and says the Department of Ag gave me the okay to do this burn, you can know that unfortunately that's not accurate, right? That there needs to be a little more like conversation before you let the person go. So there was a learning from that and things that will move on. And then the annual report for our agency is completed. You will all get a digital copy of that. Just want to make you aware of that. And we did get a little uptick in complaints for international paper a couple weeks ago now. And as part of that, because there was about 20-ish complaints about the smell, it turns out that IP is or actively is doing dredging of their water. What's the term, Max? Yeah, the
Settling basins, yes.
Settling
Wastewater
basins.
treatment.
Yeah, and so we have an inspector, myself, and I believe one other person that'll be going to kind of touch base, see the dredging operations, try to just kind of to take some level of action because there wasn't anything that IP reported or we had any reason to believe other than just normal operations that was causing an acute increase in odor. But a lot of people were calling and reporting, and with the internet, folks can set up kind of these little shops, you know, where they're kind of communicating about it and then urging one another to do it. And I'm not belittling what they're experiencing. It just, there was folks that were on the very far west side of Eugene saying that they were experiencing the same things that folks that live like 4 blocks from IP. That's where you're like, well, are you actually experiencing this? Or is it, you know, more you want to help push this forward because you believe that's
I
problematic?
live on Kelly Butte and
Uh-huh.
it was foul.
So
I mean,
you were
I'm
getting-
telling you, it was just like, it actually stung my eyes. I had my windows open at night. At 6 a.m, I got up, my eyes were stinging. I had to run HEPA filters for like 6 hours to
Yeah,
try to clean my indoor air.
wow.
So it was bad.
Yeah. And so, yeah, and they had said that, yeah, we were dredging and so we're looking into, because the timeline, they had ceased dredging because they were having issues with the dewatering process. But again, as part of the citizen advisory, I think it's important that you all, you know, kind of are aware of some of these things that maybe are on your radar, maybe not. So.
Thank you for the update. Well, nothing for me. So I guess without further ado, sorry we went over, but that was a great meeting. So we will go ahead and adjourn. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, I appreciate the
Thank you.
kind of in person. I think that these are great and I think that we're having some good conversations and dialogue. So thank you, everybody.
Help yourself to some carb.
Yes,
There you go.
Yeah.
Hard time choosing. I was like, sun chip, sun chip.
Oh, treat yourself.
Yeah.
I took one.